how would you define death? What does, when you hear the word death, what does that mean to you?
I think death, well, in many, many ways, doesn't it? Death, we see death as the end. And it is the saying goodbye to not often immense love, and the memories and all of that kind of thing. And I think one of the things that I really try to do when it's not me, when I'm trying to walk with families through that, is try and enable them to see that this isn't the end, that actually the love carries on, that the memories at the moment, yes, they absolutely make you want to curl up in a ball and cry. Yeah. But there will come a time when you can remember the happy times as well. And that's even without, you know, I don't tend to talk to families too much about what happens after you die, because that doesn't seem to be people's concern generally. Yeah. They just want to know, how the heck do I get through this? Yeah. And yeah, and there is so much that does end when death comes. And how do we walk with people through that? And I think one of the real, and that's why I was really pleased to actually have this conversation, because we don't talk about it enough, which means that when it happens, it is such a shock and no one knows what to expect. And yes, we can see these nice pretty graphs about grieving process, but that, yeah. I don't know anyone that actually follows those nice pretty graphs. It's you know, it just feels like utter chaos. And because in our culture we don't talk about that, there's just this utter devastation and not knowing what to expect, that it's just really hard for people as you walk with them through that. So yeah, I'm not sure that answered the question, Deb.
No, that's good. No, but I think you raise a really good point. I think you know, this grief being a process that you work through, and it's this stage followed by this stage followed by this stage.
Yeah,
you know, it just doesn't hold together when it actually comes. And like you say, it is that kind of just chaotic mess of all sorts of feelings and emotions that you don't know whether you should or shouldn't feel, and nobody talks about it, so you're left kind of pretty confused.
And so I was talking to someone the other day whose husband had died, and he had dementia, and actually she talked about an immense sense of relief that actually she didn't need to care for him and worry about him anymore, but felt really guilty about that. But I was able to put her in touch with other people who had had similar circumstances, who all felt the same way actually when the end came, but we don't talk about it, so everyone feels guilty about it. It just, if only we would talk about this stuff, we'd know that, okay, this is an okay feeling, and yes, I'm sad, but actually there is some relief as well, and that's okay.
It's okay to admit that. Yeah. So you've touched on sort of in what you've said so far, the concept that you work with death and grief in a professional capacity. We can see the collar around your neck, so you know, as a vicar, you know, you work and journey with people through their experiences, and alluded to the fact that you've, on a personal level, you've encountered death, grief, loss as well. So you've talked a little bit more about the sort of the professional level. Are you happy to share sort of how it's been for you on a personal level, what you've experienced, who, when, how, anything that you want to share around that?
Yeah, so when I was training to be a vicar, we moved across the country from Kent to Bristol, and the day we moved, I was sitting surrounded by packing boxes in the new house. Actually, it may have been the day after we moved, and I got a phone call from my mum to say that my dad's test results had come back, and he had cancer and it was untreatable, and they would do what they could, but there was no way they could cure it, and this was terminal. And that was August the 17th, and we'd literally just moved from being an hour from them to being 3-4 hours, depending on the traffic on the motorways. And it just felt devastating. But then we kind of talked about it, and it was like, okay, there's no cure, but perhaps there is stuff they can do. And then we also got the news that, my husband's mum had been battling cancer for some time, and it became increasingly clear that that was also not going in the way we would want it to do. And so my mum's husband died in the December of that year, and then my dad died in the February. And it utterly it just completely knocked me down. I think one of the things that we also don't realise is that we do put coping strategies in. And what I found is when my husband's mum died, that was huge and massive. But we had coping strategies. I kind of knew how to deal with that. To then lose my dad less than 2 months later, everything that I had as a coping strategy was stripped away. I had nothing left. I was emotionally, spiritually exhausted. And at this point, I was at Bible college. And the last thing I wanted to do was talk about God. We were just entering Easter season where, you know, in Bible college, you have to go to morning prayer and things like that. And it's all about death, where is your sting? And I was like, do you know what? It is right here. It's stabbing me in the heart. I can't do this. And the other thing about Bible college is people are really nice to you. And I could not deal with people being nice to me. So, and I literally had nothing. And I could barely get through a chapel service without crying. I could barely get through anything without crying. At the time, we also had a newborn baby who did not sleep for more than 45 minutes at a time, night or day. So we were also actually physically exhausted. And what did I learn from that time? I have no idea, other than you can try and help people walk through this, but sometimes you've just got to sit with them in the utter just bleakness of it, really. And the worst thing that happened is when I went to someone to ask them to pray, because my dad had been told that the chemo that he was having wasn't working and they would have to stop it, and that meant that he probably didn't have a huge amount of time left. He always refused to ask how long he had left. Okay. But we were aware that it meant it probably wasn't long. And they prayed for him to be healed. And I get why they did that, but I was furious. I nearly swore then, but you're recording this, so I won't. But I was like, I do not need you to do that now. All I need you to do is sit with me in this awfulness. So it can be utterly devastating. And I think that is one of the biggest things that I learned, that sometimes, however much we want to, you just cannot make this better for people. Sometimes absolutely all you can do is sit with them. And my prayer life for months was either me sobbing or just shouting at God. I was so angry with him, because when I got the call to say from my sister to say, you need to get here, Dad is not going to make it much longer. I got the first train I could, packed up stuff for me and the baby, who was 4 or 5 months old at the time, got on a train and didn't make it in time. And the whole way I was desperately praying, God, please just let him last till I get there. I just want to say goodbye. And I didn't make it. And I just thought, God, why could he not have just lasted another hour so that I could say goodbye? And it's the same for my husband as well. When his mum died, he rushed across the country and made it 20 minutes after she died. And so I was furious at God, utterly furious. That he'd called us across the country, you know, to start with. We could have been an hour away, and now we were 3 or 4 hours away. Utterly furious that all of this had happened, and it just felt like he was nowhere to be found, is the honest truth. So that is my personal experience of walking through grief, and all I learned from that is that sometimes that is what it's like. You know, yes, sometimes you can help people to talk about it and comfort them, and you know, but sometimes you've just got to acknowledge that this is awful, and who knows where God is in this. But I'm here with you, and that's all I can do at the moment. So I think,
that, I mean, you said so much there. It's so profound. I think we do live in this fix-it culture. We want to make things better. And I think it is probably an element of human nature when people meet somebody that's grieving, either they steer clear because they just don't know what to say, or they try and say all these things that they want because they just want to make it better. But like you say, often we just can't. It's just a place people have to be, and just to be able to be alongside and sit with people in that moment is often all that you can do, and that is actually all that's required, because nothing is going to make it better. Nothing can change it.
No, absolutely.
So that was what, nearly 5 years ago, Levi's?
Yeah, 2016. Where are we now? Yeah, 5 years ago.
Okay.
My word, time flies.
How have things changed since then? How obviously you talk about obviously you have a faith, and that was shaken to its core during that time. How have things changed? What got you through? Was it just the sort of passage of time? How has grief been in the last 4 or 5 years? Because you know, what is it like now?
I mean, it comes in waves, doesn't it? And this is why I think, you know, that whole like cycle of grief that we were talking about before, it doesn't work like that in my experience. I can still cycle back to being incredibly angry. However, what has kept me going through that time is the thing that has kept me going actually throughout all of life. And that is this unshakable belief that actually there is a God and he does love us. And it's okay if nothing makes sense. Like, I think less things make sense to me now than they did when I was kind of 18. And I knew exactly what I believed. Now I'm like, do you know what? I haven't got a clue, but that's okay, because over all of that, I know that God is there and that he is fundamentally a God of love. And I just need to do what I can to live in that love and show that around. But I still do sometimes get angry, and I still do sometimes think, you know, why did this happen in the way that it did? And I don't think I'll ever get any answers to that. No. Beyond the fact actually that what the reason we knew my dad was going to die is because he had decided that was it. They without going into too much detail, they could have forced him to start breathing again, and he refused that treatment. And because he had decided enough was enough, he said, no, call my wife, I'm done, essentially. And so that was his choice in that moment, that actually he just could not fight this anymore. And in that moment, did I really want God to force him to stay alive for another hour when he choked? You know, so all of that going on as well. So, you know, I genuinely, like, I think people often think that people who are in leadership or people who are ordained or people, you know, all of those things have the answers. I haven't got those answers. Genuinely, I haven't got a clue. But all I know is that God has been faithful throughout the centuries, and he's not going to stop with me. So and one of the things that's just kept me going, there were times when all I could do was recite kind of ancient prayers, and that reminder that, okay, this moment was bleak, and this moment I have no idea where God is, but I sit here with a crowd of witnesses for whom God has been faithful through world wars and through other pandemics, and you know, all of, you know, it doesn't stop here now. He doesn't just abandon us, even when it feels like he has. So I don't have the answers beyond that, really.
Okay. That's very honest. I like that. So you went through sort of losing, or the death of your dad, your husband's mum. Obviously there were other family members involved in that. How was it with them? How were relations with the family? Sort of, you know, when we think about the work we do, obviously, you know, we work with the client that is referred to us by the funeral directors. That's our main point of contact, but there's always other family members, or often are other family members. How did you share grief with them? Was that an easy thing to do? You know, and maybe as well, working with the families that you do, what do you observe about the way that families interact?
Death is a weird thing, isn't it, that does weird things to family dynamics, and I don't think any family is immune from that. Some might hide it a bit better than others. Like some, it's right on the surface and you think, okay, I need to handle this really carefully. But for everybody, I think because death makes us, is the final thing that makes us realize we have no control, and so people are desperately trying to claw that control back. So even in our family, where, you know, things were, you know, we were basically just trying to get through and plan the funeral and stuff like that, we had disagreements over whether there should be prayers in there or whether there shouldn't, or because people want to control what is uncontrollable.
Yeah.
And so if they can't control the fact that there's someone that they love has died, I want to control how we say goodbye to them. And nobody wants to do that in the same way, because even, you know, growing up in the same household, or, you know, the relationship that we have with that person is unique.
Yeah.
So I think it can be really hard at those moments. And people try and give and take to a certain extent, some more than others, but there's always this kind of resentment that, and I think the resentment genuinely is, this person is dead and I couldn't control that. But that's not how it always comes out. So always tensions. And yeah, we had that in our family too, you know. And again, that's another thing we never think about. We always think everyone else's family is kind of this perfect unit, that because we only see what people want us to see.
Yeah.
But actually, every single family has weird dynamics, and people that are a bit odd, and people that lose their temper too quickly, and that is so close to the surface when you're planning a funeral that sometimes it becomes unmanageable. Yeah.
Okay, so the question you can't answer, because none of us can, so just your opinion, just and maybe what you've gleaned from talking to others. What do you think happens when we die and beyond?
I genuinely think that, like, the thing that I hold on to is that verse in the Bible where it says there's no more sickness, no more death, no more sadness, and there is a place where we go where actually all of this is wiped away, all of the confusion that we have, all of the not understanding, or whether it's wiped away or it genuinely doesn't matter anymore. And there is a place where there is no more sickness and no more dying, and we will see people again. And who will be there? I genuinely think most people will be there. Like, the heart of God is a God of love, and I can't imagine that God of love doesn't welcome pretty much everybody into that place. So yeah, there is a place where we will see people again, and we will, where we're welcomed into that heart of love, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm jumping around a bit, but you have 3 children. So you talked about when your dad died, your youngest was very small, but your other 2 were slightly older, able to comprehend what was going on with both of their grandparents at that time. How did you approach it with them? What did you say, not exactly what you said to them, but what was the kind of, what angle did you take? Because for families that we work with, there's often children involved, and people trying to work out how and what they should or could say to children. And what do you advise with the families that you support in your role too?
I genuinely think this is the fundamental thing about us not talking about death, is children don't know how to cope with it because they never see us coping with it. And so I tried to involve my children as much as possible, and I didn't, I think let's use the language that is actually true. Like, I remember when I was probably about 17, and someone came to the door and said they'd lost their wife, and I was like, well, shall we go and look for her? Like, and I just think that kind of language doesn't help. So we've always been honest about death. That someone has died, they're not lost, they haven't passed away, they have died, and they are not coming back, but we will see them again in heaven. And so being honest about that with children. And in terms of inviting them to the funeral, they were fairly, I'm trying to think back actually, how old are they now? Good Lord, I have no idea. So the first funeral they went to was actually Eb's nan, so my husband's nan. And they were quite little then, they were probably 6 and 7, something like that. And people asked whether we should take them, but I genuinely think the physicality of going through a funeral helps with that, helping them to process that someone has gone and is not coming back. And I think if we shield them from that, it's harder for them to process it. And again, if we shield them from us crying, it's harder for them to know that it's okay to be sad about this if we try and pretend that everything is fine. So let them go through it with you. Was always my policy, and that doesn't work for everybody, and I would never say that that is absolutely the right thing, but for us that's what worked. And my daughter, it hit her really, really hard, and probably, you know, 5 years later she still hasn't fully recovered from that, because there's this real realization that anyone could die at any moment, but that is the genuine truth of the world. So I don't think that's necessarily a problem. It's just enabling her to hold that in a way that is appropriate for her. And my husband's mum was buried rather than cremated, and there was just this moment at the funeral where she was just standing after the coffin had gone into the grave with gut-wrenching sobs. There was a moment where I was like, should we have brought her here? But actually, yes, because she needed to do that. She needed to be able to release that. And where and how do you do that if it's not in those moments where actually you are saying that goodbye? So be honest with them. And I think however much you include them in the funeral, absolutely be honest with them. Don't try and shield them from what has happened and is happening, because they need to be able to process it in the same way that we need to be able to process it.
Yeah, that's really helpful, thank you. So the other question I kind of had around death was, I don't know, there's this kind of, when someone dies, people talk about sort of a sense of something more, a sense of something other. Do people allude to that with you in your work? Is that something you've experienced? You've used the word God quite openly. That isn't always the language that people understand, or if they hear the word God, there's an automatic assumption of something. So when we talk about death, do people that you work with, people that you support, give other language around it? Have you come across other ways?
Yeah, I think absolutely. When people are actually there when people die, and I think one of the hardest things over this last year is that people haven't always been there when people die. They do talk of however much of a battle and a struggle it's been up to that point. At the point of death, there is an immense peace. And it's one of the things that makes it clearer to me that there's something afterwards, because I think there is a moment, possibly not universally, but in most cases, where actually the person gives up this life and is welcomed into something else. And in that moment, there's immense peace. And one of the absolute holiest moments of my life was praying with someone who was very close to death. And we prayed together, and then we said the Lord's Prayer. And when she opened her eyes, all I can say is in that moment, I saw a glimpse of heaven. Wow. And it had such a profound effect on me that I've never forgotten it. And so there is something around that moment of death where we catch a glimpse of something that is beyond the struggle of this life. And that's probably about as much as I can say on that.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Okay, is there anything else that you want to say on death? Anything else that you've thought of as you've thought about us talking today?
No, I think the only other thing I would say about planning a funeral is that so often people think and say to me sometimes, oh, can I do this? Can I do that? Can we have this song? And it has to be a way for you to honor and say goodbye to that person. And I don't think there should be any cans or shoulds or musts in the midst of that. This is about your relationship with them, what they meant to you. And that's where the arguments that we were coming in earlier, that's where that comes in, because everybody wants to do that differently. But somehow you have to honor that. And one of the things that I often say to people, which is a bit of a cliche, but I think it's absolutely true, that grief is the price we pay for love. And the only way we can stop grieving is if we stop loving, and no one wants to do that.
Yeah.
So allow that love to be held in the grief, but say goodbye in the way you want. Recently I had to take over the reading of someone's tribute. It was in a church I'd not been in before. I was covering for someone else, and as I took over the reading, because she couldn't quite do it, there were so many swear words in this tribute. I was just like, oh my goodness, what are you doing to me? But that was what they needed in that moment. That was, you know, so I just read these words with the church wardens at the back. Just I didn't quite know what to think, I don't think. But that was the way that they needed to say goodbye. And there genuinely is no should or must or can, or, you know, just say goodbye in the best way you can and capture that person in the best way that you can. Because there is nothing worse than a funeral that you just feel has been going through the motions, rather than actually capturing the heart of the person that you're saying goodbye to and the relationship that you had with them.
Yeah, that's very true. And and I think, like you said about grief, there's a lovely quote, isn't there? I'm never going to remember it properly, but you know, grief is that love that you can no longer give to the person directly, that has to be expressed somehow. And there was another really good analogy for grief that I read in a book somewhere. It's like a container for all of the emotions that you carry, and it's almost like you carry around this little box, and all of these different emotions come out at different times. I spoke to somebody else doing one of these interviews this week, and she talked about how when her friend died, she would laugh, and then she'd feel guilty because she was able to laugh. And so one minute she was laughing, then she was feeling guilty, then she was tearful, and then she was angry, and then you know, you just end up very confused. And grief is all of those things, and there is no wrong way. There's no wrong way to grieve. There's no right way to grieve. Grief just and the fact that it goes on, and you can think you're feeling better and that you're coping, and then it can be the slightest thing that just takes you by surprise, and you're right back to where you thought you'd moved on from, and you've changed, you have moved forwards, but the slightest things can still trigger those emotions.
Anniversaries were a major thing for me after my dad died, which anniversaries have never been a big thing for me. Like, I can barely remember when my birthday is, let alone anyone else's birthday or big anniversaries or things like that. And yet a year after my dad died, I genuinely felt back in that pit that I'd been in a year previously, and it still hits me quite hard now, 5 years on. I know 5 years isn't a huge amount of time, but that really surprised me, because I've never been big on anniversaries. Whereas some people are, like, so my husband will go to his mum's grave on the anniversary of her death and her funeral, because that is really important to him and to his family, whereas it never has been for us. And so I genuinely was utterly confused by this. Why am I feeling like this today? And then realized that it was because it was a year. And so I think just be prepared that things won't necessarily kind of be how you thought they would be, and weird things can put you back there, and that's okay. You just need to hold that for a little bit, and sit with it for a bit. I think you do learn as you go through that you're not always going to feel like that. I think in the immediate aftermath of the event, you think you will always feel that sad and that lost and that bewildered. So then as you journey through and you end up feeling sad and bewildered and lost again, you've learned that you don't always feel like it. So that does change. And then there is that, because I love the concept of ritual, and I know that I come from a sort of very sort of spiritual religious background, and for some people the concept of ritual can be a big sort of like, oh no, I'm not religious. But that kind of creating those rituals can help some people. So like your husband going back to the grave is kind of a ritual. It doesn't do that. But sort of rituals that enable us to hold those moments can be really, really useful as well. Cool. Well, thank you for talking. Thank you. It's actually a joy to talk about this stuff, because I just think it is vital that we do. It just, and I read a really good book called From Here to Eternity, and it talks about death rituals all over the world, and
You know, in the UK, we have got it so wrong. It's so frustrating.
Oh, we hide it away so much, don't we?
Yeah, it's so sanitized, isn't it? And just neat, and it never used,
even to the extent that, you know, crematoriums are always out in the middle of nowhere. You know, that whereas horrific as it is, you know, so often those death rituals take place in the heart of the community around the world. You know, this is something that the whole community engages in, whereas we kind of siphon it off and go, can you just go over there and be sad for a bit, because I really don't need this to affect me.
And I think, and generations ago, it wouldn't have been how it is now, because, you know, the grandparents would have been living in the same village, or at least possibly the same house as you, and the children would have watched grandma get weaker and fall asleep in the corner and not wake up. They would have been exposed to it, and now it's care homes and hospitals, and we just don't embrace it as a culture in the way that we used to, and in the way that other cultures across the world still do. And I think that's to our loss, really. You know, it affects our mental health and all sorts, because we don't face it. So we'll see where these conversations go. And
excellent.